Cuba, our sister republic. Cuba, our sister republic. Its people, its resources, and its possibilities, with a review of its long struggle for freedom, and its ultimate success, together with a magnificent pictorial presentation of its mountains, valleys, harbors, rivers, cities, provinces, etc., etc. Historical and descriptive text by Colonel James Cox, author of Our Own Country, My Native Land, From Dongola to Khartoum, etc., etc. Illustrations from original photographs specially secured for this work at great expense and personal risk. The Patriot Act Publishing Co., 618 N. 2nd Street, St. Louis, MO. Cuba, our sister republic. We have neither apology nor explanation to offer for our title. The government of the United States has declared the gem of the Antilles to be free, and the curse of Spanish tyranny and misrule is already a thing of the past. The blot on the world's history can never be effaced, but the marvelous resources of the island will soon enable it to wipe out all traces of the blight under which it has suffered for generations. In a word, Cuba will be prosperous as well as free, and the new republic will speedily advance, both in wealth and influence. The island of Cuba is over 700 miles in length from east to west. At its narrowest part, its north and south shorelines are about 22 miles distant. Its total area is about 45,000 square miles, greater than that of the state of Ohio. Millions of acres are covered by virgin forests, but under the fostering influence of self-government and with the aid of American capital, the acreage under cultivation will increase with amazing rapidity. The encouragement for enterprise is abundant, for the soil of Cuba is unequaled the world over for productiveness. In the words of General Fitzhugh Lee, everything grows abundantly in a short time. This phenomenal fertility proved the insurgents' greatest ally during their long struggle for freedom. Potatoes and other vegetables, raised in an incredibly brief period in some shaded nook on the mountainside, furnished plain but healthy food for the patriots, and the product of an acre planted with corn, is, and has always been, amazing. Tobacco and sugar can be cultivated at a handsome profit under conditions of peace. Although Spain's iron hand has curbed enterprise and retarded development, the exported product of the island had reached about $100 million a year when the last insurrection commenced. Cuba is one of the garden spots of the world. It abounds in picturesque scenery, in magnificent abruptness, and in pastoral loveliness. Nature has been lavish with her gifts, man alone has been cruel and destructive. The climate is semi-tropical in character, and naturally healthy. Yellow fever has been prevalent in the larger cities, simply because of the total neglect of necessary hygienic and sanitary precautions. Well drained and sewered, Havana can be made a healthy city, and as soon as the last of the Spanish tyrants has been finally driven out of the country, the necessary capital and energy will be forthcoming and the good work will begin. The average temperature is about 77 degrees, and the thermometer seldom climbs to an unpleasant height. The rainy season is the principal reminder of the proximity to the tropics, and scientists will watch with interest the effect of the inevitable clearing of forest land upon the rainfall. The people of Cuba are deserving of the sympathy that has been extended to them of late. No greater mistake can be made than to imagine that the bulk of the population is of Negro descent. Prior to the rebellion there were more than 1.5 million inhabitants, of whom less than 400,000 were Negroes. The native Cubans are of Spanish descent, and speak the language of their forefathers. They are as a rule well educated, industrious and thrifty, as compared with the Spanish immigrant who is almost invariably uneducated, thriftless, and disorderly. Man is notoriously influenced by environment, and, removed from the demoralizing influences of Spain, the native-born citizens of our sister republic have created a nationality of their own. They retain the traditional Castilian pride and sense of honor, but they are happily freed from those characteristics of cruelty and deceit which have made the modern Spaniard an object of distrust and even execration. Of the actual resources of Cuba the general information is incomplete, and in a measure misleading. It is more than probable that gold may be discovered when the inland district and the numerous creek beds are more thoroughly examined. Gold and silver have both been extracted from time to time, but there is no record of paying or having been found. Copper, on the other hand, has been profitably mined, and it is believed there are great possibilities in this direction. There are also traces of iron. Coal is abundant and of exceptionally good quality. Marble and onyx have also been mined, as well as large quantities of slate. The forest wealth of the island can only be surmised. Cuban ebony has an established reputation, and there would appear to be scarcely any limit to the yield of mahogany, cedar, and the costliest hardwoods. Palms are exceptionally abundant. Fruits of every description can be raised easily, and the yield of oranges and pineapples is very large. Corn is indigenous to Cuban soil, and the potato has been a staple product for centuries. Sugar plantations were numerous prior to the insurrection, and several have survived the horrors of prolonged civil war and ruthless reprisals. Under the better conditions now assured, the sugar industry will revive and the value of the exports will run into long rows of figures. The tobacco of Cuba is popular wherever cigars are smoked. The yield is enormous, and with capital encouraged by a stable government and equitable taxation, only the manufacture of cigars will furnish remunerative employment for thousands of men and women. There will also be a marked increase in the acreage of tobacco plantations. Coffee has been successfully cultivated in Cuba for about 150 years, though not to the extent that circumstances would seem to warrant. The climate and soil are alike suitable, and a heavy increase in the output is looked for from now on. As is to be expected, the roads of Cuba are not good. The contour of the bulk of the island is exceedingly rough, and there has never been the proper incentive for activity in road building. This drawback has proved of immeasurable advantage to the so-called insurgents. The patriots have been able to force their way through forests and rough places, absolutely closed against the Spanish artillery, and almost as much so against the army generally. A long era of peace will change the aspect of the country in many ways, and the building of a series of good roads will be one of the first evidences of prosperity. Railroads connect the principal cities. The first track was laid about 60 years ago, and quite an extensive system has been built up. The rivers, though, do not afford important transportation facilities. Most of them run north and south and are necessarily short. A few exquisite cascades may be mentioned among the scenic grandeurs of our sister republic. The island is divided into 6 provinces: Pina del Rio, Havana, Matanzas, Santa Clara, Puerto Príncipe, and Santiago de Cuba. Each has for its capital a city bearing its own name. Havana, or Habana, is the only very large city from an American standpoint. Its full name is San Cristobal de la Havana, and the population is between 250,000 and 300,000. It is strongly fortified from the sea, and was formerly encompassed by a well-built wall which protected it from attacks from inland. Wooden buildings are found in the suburbs, but in the city itself marble and stone-stroke effigies with flat roofs are general. Cigar factories are numerous, and a little manufacturing of other kinds is carried on. It is considered bad form for ladies to walk in the streets, and hence the number of private carriages is exceptionally large. The streets are as a rule extremely narrow, and small blockades of traffic are numerous. Nearly all the houses are constructed so as to withstand attack, every window being well guarded. The shutters are carefully closed at night, as the temperature generally falls rapidly in the early morning. Carpets are not used, and the brick or marble floors strike the visitor from abroad as very odd. In the outskirts the poorer classes live in squalor and distress, and when disease breaks out it can generally be traced to one of these neglected sections. The history of Cuba is one continuous recital of cruelty and oppression. The blighting hand of a conscienceless nation has been ever apparent, and the people have been oppressed and defrauded for generation after generation. Early in the 16th century the Spaniards took possession of the island, which they called Juana, in honor of the son of Ferdinand and Isabella. The name has been changed 3 or 4 times since, finally reverting to the original and present one. The Aborigines of Cuba were an inoffensive race. They were speedily reduced to slavery by the newcomers, whose cruelty soon resulted in extermination. The importation of African Negroes as slaves followed, and much labor was expended in searching for the rich deposits of gold which tradition said abounded in the valleys. The office of Captain General was created in 1589 and continued to exist for more than 3 centuries. The different holders of it, from Tejeda to Blanco, have exhibited various degrees of tyranny and oppression, and have sacrificed the interests of the colony to those of the mother country. The great object has always been to extort money from the people in the way of taxes, and self-aggrandizement has not been lost sight of. Hence corruption became common and the best interests of the island were more and more ignored. Gradually there arose among the oppressed inhabitants a determination to throw off the yoke of Spain, and there has been no general loyalty to the Spanish throne since the early part of the century. It was not, however, until about 50 years ago that a determined strike for freedom was made. In 1848 General Narciso Lopez organized an insurrection. His plans were well made, but he failed to receive the support promised, and with difficulty escaped with his life. Landing in the United States, he gathered together quite a number of Cuban exiles, and 2 years later landed at Cardenas with a force of 650 men. The garrison was overpowered, and the soldiers agreed to join the ranks of the invaders. The victory was of no value. The people were unprepared for the movement and failed to join it, so that Lopez had to fight his way back to his ships and abandon the attempt. In 1851 he again landed with a party of about 400, and again failing to receive support was finally overpowered and captured. The only favor he asked was that the inevitable death should be that of a soldier. But the Spanish government ignored his request, and he was garroted. The next uprising of importance took place in the fall of 1868, when about 100 men, headed by Charles M. de Cespedes, defied the tyrannical officers of Spain and broke into open rebellion. The people were ripe for revolt, and although the movement commenced inauspiciously and even insignificantly, 15,000 determined men soon responded to the cry of Free Cuba. This was the beginning of the 10 Years' War, which, while unproductive of immediate results, paved the way for final emancipation. A republic was declared established, Cespedes was elected president, and a constitution prepared. The first 2 years of the war saw the Cubans victorious in frequent engagements. Their numbers increased rapidly, thousands more rallying round the standard than it was possible to arm. Loyal Cubans abroad tried again to land arms and ammunition, but the expeditions were intercepted or driven back by the Spanish ships, which maintained an effective blockade. In 1871 the Patriot Army in the vicinity of Camagny became discouraged and offered to surrender, conditionally on their lives being spared. The necessary guarantees being forthcoming, they laid down their arms, and their commander, General Agramonte, found himself unsupported except by the members of his personal staff. His position was regarded as hopeless and his capture certain. But his oppressors forgot that a Cuban hero can never be judged by ordinary rules. Agramonte laughed at all invitations to surrender with honor. He worked day and night until he had raised a splendid cavalry regiment, with whose assistance he regained control of the lost territory. For 2 years he was a thorn in the sides of the Spanish authorities, but in 1873 he was killed while leading his forces to victory against tremendous odds. It was at about this time that the Havana Volunteers, whose arrogance has been recently demonstrated, came into existence. In all the large cities those whose interests made it desirable to perpetuate Spanish rule over the island organized battalions of volunteers. The loyalty of these men was more in words than acts, and almost from the first they refused to obey orders which were not pleasing to them. The Havana Volunteers were exceptionally aggressive and brutal. One of their earliest acts was to fire repeatedly upon an audience leaving a theater in which Cubans had performed. Later on they deposed the Captain General and sent him home to Spain. Then they turned their attention to the outlying districts, sacking country residences, and murdering or exiling inoffensive and strictly neutral Cubans. The murder of 8 young medical students by these ruffians may be mentioned as one of the most heartless crimes of the century. The volunteers arrested 43 students under the flimsy charge of scratching the glass plate on a volunteer's monument. There was no evidence against the boys, who were promptly acquitted. The volunteers immediately demanded a trial by court-martial, with members of their company in control. The Captain General was cowardly enough to yield, a mock trial was held and 8 of the boys were sentenced to death. 15,000 volunteers turned out to execute the sentence, which was condemned generally, even by the Spanish Army of Occupation. Military discipline is necessarily severe, but it is seldom that youthful noncombatants are sacrificed in a time of alleged peace. The Virginia slaughter almost involved Spain in a war with the United States. The Virginius was an American steamer, chartered by the Cuban insurgents to land arms and provisions on the island. The Spanish cruiser captured her after a lively chase, and although the captain's papers were perfectly regular and he was sailing under the American flag, the crew was treated as pirates. The ship was brought into port the evening of November 1, 1873, and on November 4 4 of those captured on board were shot. On November 7 the captain and the entire crew suffered the same fate. In spite of protests from Washington the executions continued, although an indemnity was finally extracted from the government in whose name these wholesale murders had been committed. During the next 2 years the Patriots gained much ground, but in 1875 their strength fell off. Martinez Campos then brought 25,000 fresh troops into the field and announced his intention to finish the war at once. He found the task more difficult than he expected, and finally opened up negotiations with the insurgent leaders. At last, In February 1878, peace was restored and the insurgents returned to their homes with promises of freedom from oppression and equitable representation. All promises were ignored. The Cubans were oppressed in the same manner as before, and not a ray of hope could be seen on the horizon. Spaniards were given every office, and native Cubans were overtaxed and persecuted. The system of taxation was ruinous as well as unjust, and anything bordering on prosperity was impossible. It was realized at once that the patriots had been duped into laying down their arms, and plans were immediately commenced for a final attempt to drive the Spanish out of Cuba once and for all. The Cuban junta was formed in New York, and this became the nucleus of Cuba's final and successful struggle for freedom. In February 1895, the struggle actually commenced. Antonio Maceo, Maximo Gomez, José Martí, and other trusted leaders came to the front, and the Spanish government found itself face to face with a powerful force. From the first raising of the Cuban flag 3 years ago, until the declaration of war by the United States against Spain, the insurgents, as they have been rather inaccurately called, have never wavered. Calleja, Campos, Weyler, and Blanco, the 4 captain generals who have been opposed to them, have tried to bribe the leaders whom they could not subdue, but with invariable lack of success. At least 150,000 Spanish soldiers were killed or invalided in the attempt to stamp out patriotism by brute force, and it was because of the suffering caused by Spain's inhuman methods to force into subjection a foe they could not conquer that the United States finally, on April 25, 1898, declared war against the oppressors, and thereby made our sister republic an accomplished fact. The blowing up of the Maine in Havana Harbor by Spanish treachery aroused the American people to a full sense of the situation, and the memory of the 266 men who were murdered in cold blood should ever be held in reverence by Cuba and its people. The illustrations which appear in this work are all from original photographs. Just prior to the declaration of war, the feeling in Cuba against Americans became intensely bitter. It was dangerous for an American to walk the streets of Havana or any other large city, as constant attempts were made to incite them to violence by means of studied and repeated insult. While this feeling was at its height, our corps of artists landed with one of the relief expeditions, and negatives were secured of places and features of interest. Taking grave chances of arrest and something worse, they photographed forts and guns, as well as more innocent objects. Dangers were dodged, insults were ignored, and finally the artists were able to leave the island, bringing with them negatives of great value. Their trip from the hotel to the wharf was a perilous one, and how they got through uninjured is a mystery they themselves cannot explain. As a result of their skill and bravery combined, we are able to present a series of pictures which will be appreciated at once for their obvious accuracy, and for their singular appropriateness at this particular time. Copyright, 1898, by G. W. Curtis. Morro Castle from Havana Harbor. This is an exceptionally fine view of Morro Castle, showing its heavy walls and complete isolation. A glance at the picture explains how the theory that no prisoner can possibly escape from El Morro has almost become gospel in Cuba. Fortunately, this is not wholly correct, as several of those incarcerated have succeeded in regaining their liberty. But this has generally been by means of collusion with guards, the precautions against escape and the natural safeguards having, as a rule, proved sadly effective. Legends concerning this fortress and prison abound among the people of Cuba, and the awe and hatred which exist concerning it are easily accounted for. Seen near the Ignacia sugar mill. The first skirmish of the rebellion which broke out in 1895 took place here. Antonio López de Colonna was concealed with a small body of men in the vicinity of the mill and was captured by the Spanish. The day before this unfortunate event he had been joined at the sugar mill by his lady love, Señorita Obra. She also was captured and was incarcerated in San Severino Castle. After being released, she ran away from home again and followed her lover to Morro Castle. She aided him to escape, became his wife, and, allying herself desperately with the cause, became in every sense of the word a fair rebel. San Juan River, Matanzas. The San Juan River runs through the center of Matanzas City, which it divides into 2 parts, known as Pueblo Nuevo and Versailles. The former is the older portion and contains the railway depot and the justly celebrated avenue, the Calzada de San Esteban. This is 2 miles long and is lined the entire length with handsome villas, whose porticos are resplendent with costly marble or gaudy tiles. The river is deep and available for navigation for a short distance. It is spanned by a number of stone bridges, one of which, the Puente Balam, bears a striking resemblance to the famous bridge across the Remy, at Lima, Peru. The illustrations give a good idea of the architecture of Matanzas residences. Interior of Morro Castle. This remarkable picture was obtained under extraordinary conditions. Our artists had a permit from the Spanish authorities to secure views, but the permit was never intended to cover the photographing of the city's fortifications. Trusting to the ignorance of the average Spanish official, the document was tendered as a card of admission to the interior of the world-renowned fort, and the ruse succeeded. A few minutes later the artists were observed by the captain of the guard, who escorted them out of the castle with more haste than courtesy. He did not, however, confiscate the camera or realize that an instantaneous picture had been taken. An old farmhouse in the Camagny district. Rudely constructed with material secured almost exclusively from the immediate vicinity of farmhouse, such as illustrated above. Affords ample protection from the variations of the climate and from the heaviest storms. In the rural districts the honesty of the neighbors is not questioned and the elaborate precautions against attack, so conspicuous in the cities, are never attempted. This house has fallen into bad repair and dilapidation, its former inhabitants having become the victims of the buzzards, called, with a brutal facetiousness, whalers' chickens. It is said to be more than 25 years old, and to have been searched repeatedly by Spanish soldiers during the 10 Years' War. Havana Harbor. The harbor at Havana is one of the finest in the world. The bay, on the western shore of which the city is located, is large enough to accommodate several large fleets at one time. It is approached by a channel 3/4 of a mile long, with a nearly uniform width of about 1,000 feet. The water both in the entrance and harbor is very deep, in spite of the neglect of the authorities, which has resulted in an accumulation of wreckage and impurities in many locations. The harbor is now very foul, owing to the inadequate sewer arrangements of the city, and its condition has led to many outbreaks of disease. Under the new regime this drawback will be speedily removed. A farmhouse in Puerto Principe. This house, in an isolated portion of the province, was, prior to 1895, owned and occupied by a small Cuban family of moderate means. For several months after the outbreak of the insurrection the building was left alone and its occupants were uninformed as to the progress of the war. One morning a rebel officer sought refuge, explaining that he was cut off from his command and in danger of capture. Food was given him and he was securely hidden before his pursuers reached the house, which they carefully searched. As the fugitive was concealed some distance away the search failed, and as no information could be extracted from the inmates they were lined up and shot. Yumara Valley. A typical scene illustrative of the great natural fertility of Cuban soil. The stately palms with their symmetrical trunks stand out in bold relief, and the accuracy of the camera gives a striking idea of their real appearance. The picturesque grandeur of the scene illustrates in unmistakable manner the majesty of natural beauty unadorned in the land of our sister republic, and opens up countless ideas of the resources of the country under good government and proper development. The productiveness of the soil in the numerous valleys, of which this is a type, is said to surpass that to be found in any other country in the world. Hotel de Inglaterra, Havana. This hotel is situated on Havana's principal street, and is of special interest from the fact that General Lee lived in it while conducting negotiations of the utmost gravity to Cuba, Spain, and the United States. The correspondents of foreign newspapers almost all had rooms in the Inglaterra, which is by far the most agreeable stopping place in the city. The building itself is substantial in character and the rooms are lofty. They lack most of the comforts usually found in first-class hotels, but the deficiencies are made up for in other ways. The table is a good one, with many dainties in profusion, and the attendance is in most respects excellent. Pineapple Grove, near Calabazar. A truly characteristic picture, showing one of the staple products of Cuba in full growth. The pineapple is very much at home on Cuban soil, and there is little or no limit to the extent or yield of the pineapple groves. They require but slight attention or cultivation, the richness of the soil ensuring a crop when the conditions are at all favorable, as they usually are during intervals of peace. The growth is so profuse that a formidable barrier to progress is presented, and a richness of color is produced that delights the artist and lover of beauty. Hundreds of acres of these groves have been destroyed by the contesting armies. Where bullfights occur. This is a section of the arena and auditorium of the building in Havana where bullfights take place. The Spaniard has clung fiercely to customs and vices which other nations have cast behind, and wherever the Spanish language is spoken the bullfight has its adherents and defenders. In this building not only the men of Havana, but the ladies as well, have applauded to the echo acts of cruelty which seem to have no palliation. Refined belles vie with each other in their clamorous applause, and the frantic efforts of the terrorized bull to escape its tormentors or avenge their attacks appear ludicrous to them rather than pathetic. Guard House, Santiago de Cuba. This is a good view of a section of the Guard House in Santiago de Cuba. This city was founded in 1514 by Diego Velázquez, who was attracted to the site by the marvelous natural harbor. At one time the town was the capital of Cuba. It is compactly built, with houses of adobe and brick lining narrow, irregular streets. There are few new houses, and even the residences are fortified against attack with heavy iron bars across the window openings. In the rear are vast mountains, which the Spanish troops have never yet been able to penetrate, and in which trees, shrubs, creeping plants, and flowers flourish all around. A Spanish boatman. Owing to Cuba's extensive coastline, a large percentage of the population are directly interested in boating, a calling which furnishes a livelihood for many families. The Spanish boatman is for the most part employed by the authorities in moving supplies from towns to forts or in unloading government vessels. The Cuban boatman has less lucrative work and represents another type. There is excellent fishing in several of the harbors, and generally along the coast. At Havana this is protected, but in most sections there are no restrictions, and fishing is a regular occupation. The boatmen have as a rule seen considerable adventure, and the patriotism of many of them has been put to the severest tests. Waiting for food. This is a group of reconcentrados waiting for the distribution of food before Consul Bryce's office in Matanzas. The Cuban professional beggar has been described again and again, but General Weyler's brutal policy made involuntary paupers of thousands of industrious people. All types of humanity are represented in the picture, for one touch of hunger, as well as nature, makes the whole world kin. There is the strong man and the feeble child, the faithful auntie and the woman who has seen better days. These people never expected much and were content with the products of the soil around their homes for food until dragged into the cities and forbidden to leave them. A view of Matanzas. Even the elder Weller would find an excuse for dropping into poetry with such a scene as this before him. All that is picturesque in nature seems crowded into the foreground, while in the rear there is the dreamy stillness of the semi-tropics. There are the little villas with neatly kept gardens and well-trimmed hedges, patches of shrubbery on right and left, and larger residences in the background. In the twilight the exquisite touches are emphasized and a general sentimental grandeur produced which needs to be seen and felt to be appreciated. Cuba, free and prosperous, will be an artist's paradise, and scenes such as these will form subjects for masterpieces in colors. Café La Luna, Havana. The restaurants of Havana are exceptionally numerous, and they are as a rule prosperous institutions. Home comforts are not appreciated at their full worth in Cuban cities, and comparatively few families of the middle or trade classes have any cooking done in their houses. As a rule but 2 meals are eaten daily. Breakfast is usually taken at home, and employment is found for large numbers of men who carry around cooked food and other items of a bill of fare and deliver them at house doors. The restaurants and cafes are thronged during the dinner hour, which is about the middle of the afternoon. Ample time is taken for the meal, and political and other discussions are continued over dessert. In Cardenas Harbor. Cardenas is a city of some importance in Matanzas province, rather more than 100 miles east of Havana. It is located on a bay much larger than that at the capital city, but less free from storms and atmospheric disturbances. The town was founded 70 years ago, and in 1850 it was attacked and captured by General Lopez. Since the outbreak of the present war the place has been frequently mentioned in dispatches, and it bids fair to become still more prominent. In many respects it affords ideal landing facilities, and some of the richest ground to be found in the wealthy Matanzas province is situated within an hour's ride of it. Chapel at Montserrat. The illustration on the left is of the front of the chapel at Montserrat, that on the right is a rear view of the same building. The structure is far out of the ordinary and represents strong religious feeling in its design and execution. It is in striking memorial of the monastery near Barcelona, Spain, one of the most remarkable religious edifices in the world. From 80,000 to 100,000 pilgrims visit it annually, and there are countless traditions bound up with it. Many Spaniards of eminence have sought within its walls religious consolation and freedom from the turmoil of daily life, others have visited it to register vows of reformation. Spanish cruisers in Cienfuegos Harbor. Cienfuegos is a town of some importance in Santa Clara province, on the south coast of Cuba. It is in direct railroad connection with Havana and has been mentioned repeatedly as the probable scene of a great naval battle. The bay is a large one, with an island near the mouth, giving a passageway on either side. The town itself is situated well within the bay and has an ideal natural harbor. Cienfuegos was named after the celebrated Spanish poet, whose career in the early years of the century made him a martyr in the eyes of many. While editor of the Spanish government organs, he published an article which offended Napoleon. He was sentenced to death, but subsequently banished. River Havana. This is a view of Havana River with portions of the city given over to manufacturing purposes. Like all the rivers in the island, this one is short, and its navigable section very limited. The Cauto is a much longer stream, traversing a large section of Santiago de Cuba province. And there are 5 or 6 fair-sized streams which discharge into the Gulf of Mexico. The river shown in the picture above is contaminated by sewage, and has in consequence a rather unmerited reputation for being unhealthy. Its channel could be kept clear without difficulty and much use made of the stream, as there are several factories along its banks. Carrying green fodder corn. Again is the generosity of Cuban soil demonstrated by means of the camera. Corn, as mentioned on an earlier page, is indigenous to the island. Early European writers speak of the profuseness of its growth and call it maize or Indian corn. The rapidity of its growth is phenomenal, and after a district has been devastated by sword and torch, a crop has been raised in an incredibly short time. As will be noted from the view, it is frequently cut early and used for fodder. The extent to which horses and mules are used in the island for pack purposes is also demonstrated by this view, which at first glance seems to portray a couple of camels instead of 2 heavily loaded, muzzled ponies. Cuban voluntad. The voluntad is a peculiar 2-wheel carriage with a strange motion while traveling that is not pleasant to the uninitiated. The diligencia is a larger vehicle with 4 wheels, and resembles the Victoria in general outline. Private carriages are the exception, most families hiring public conveyances without regard to expense. The society lady seldom walks, and as a result the fashionable thoroughfares are thronged with vehicles. These are often kept standing for an hour or more while the fair occupants receive their friends and converse with them. In the illustration, a voluntad has been called to a hotel and the livery boy is waiting patiently and without concern while preparations are being made within for the drive. Street scene in Havana. This is a view taken in the business section of Cuba's chief city, and illustrates the precautions observed to guard every window. It is not the skilled burglar who is feared in Havana, but the outlaw who will use violence rather than skill in his efforts to secure admission. The balconies are not allowed to become sources of danger, and every window is guarded as though it were in the walls of a prison. The profusion of carriages, spoken of elsewhere, is shown, as well as other features of Cuban city life. One point which cannot be overlooked is the age of the buildings. There seems to have been little or no general new construction for years. A Cuban country home. This is a type of an inexpensive country home in Cuba, as compared with the more pretentious hacienda. This latter is generally approached by an avenue of palms, whose beauty is a little impaired by the mechanical accuracy with which they were planted and the uniform manner in which they have grown. Even in the more costly dwellings there is little effort to secure what Americans or Europeans regard as comfort. In the less expensive homes, like the one illustrated, there is still less attempt to cater to the tastes of the occupants, and the simplicity becomes almost rugged. But nature furnishes on the outside ample adornment to supplant the decorations not to be found within. House in Pina del Rio. This is a villa in Pina del Rio, the principal city in the extreme western province of Cuba, and the only one west of Havana. Several times the attempt has been made to march an army across the country and drive the insurgents before it. All attempts have failed, and once when General Weyler himself took the field in this province he narrowly escaped capture, escaping in a well-guarded carriage. One of the celebrated trochas crosses the province at its narrowest point, but just as love laughs at locksmiths, so do Cuban patriots treat trochas with contempt and scorn. The town has suffered materially from the war and it will take some time to restore it. The coast at Manzanillo. Manzanillo is situated on the Gulf of Guacanabo, near the mouth of the river Yura. Although not ranking among the best harbors, considerable shipping finds anchorage before the town. In the view a lighter is approaching a larger craft in a calm sea, and the perfection of the work of art is seen in the depicting of the wave motion and of the wash in the boat's wake. There is exceptionally good fishing near the town. And, indeed, all along the coast of the Gulf, and but for the presence of sharks the bathing would be exceptionally attractive. The facilities for yachting are unsurpassed. Official residence, Santa Clara. This is a view of the residence occupied by the governor of Santa Clara Province. It is situated in the city of the same name, and is characteristic of the local architecture. Unlike a majority of the villas, It is 2 stories high, with a spacious porch above the porticos and pillars. The grounds are extensive and well kept, and the stonework at the approach is quite artistic. The grounds are enclosed by a strong wall and iron bar fence, as though to bid defiance to intruders. Much lavish entertainment has been furnished in this house. Official, residence at Santiago de Cuba. This house is the home of a Spanish official in Santiago de Cuba. His occupation, like Othello's, will soon be gone, but for years he has thrived at the expense of the native Cubans. The Spanish official in Cuba has for generations displayed an arrogance which time has never softened. The unpopularity of Spanish rule has had a sterner cause than this, but many an outbreak has been expedited by a Spanish official's hauteur and injustice. There is an air of prosperity about the house, which is easily explained, and there are none of the signs of decay and neglect visible in so many native homes. Matanzas from across the Yumara Valley. Matanzas is the chief city of the province of that name, and it has been spoken of as the probable temporary capital of the new republic. The population has reached as high as 60,000, though at the present time it is less than half that number. The town in some respects is more modern than Havana, and it is far healthier. The streets are narrow, but on the wider than those in the present capital. The name is an unfortunate one, signifying slaughter pen. It was given to the town because of the number of cattle slaughtered in it for the Havana market. More recently, it is to be regretted, the name has become appropriate for other reasons. Morro Castle, or El Morro, from the shore. This is the product of a snapshot from our artist's camera. To obtain the picture the greatest risk had to be run, as the Spanish authorities in and around Havana were on the constant lookout for spies, of whose presence they were very suspicious. The picture gives a good idea of the solid masonry of Havana's great prison and fort. It was originally constructed in 1589 by command of Philip II of Spain, but subsequent editions have entirely remodeled it and changed its general appearance. It is popularly known as El Morro, and has for many years been regarded by the Spaniards as impregnable. Drawbridge entrance to Morro Castle. The casual reader of Cuban news is puzzled by the apparent ubiquity of Morro Castle, or Fort Morro, which is mentioned in connection with nearly every large harbor in either Cuba or Puerto Rico. The explanation is that Morro means a promontory, so that Morro Castle is equivalent to the castle on the promontory. The illustration shows the idea well. Never safe from foe by sea or land, Spain has constructed and equipped forts at the entrance to the harbor, which is located in a bottle-shaped bay, with high cliffs at the entrance. Nature's aid thus obtained, and the guns, until silenced, could do double execution, owing to their altitude. Valley near Manzanillo. This is one of the garden spots of Cuba, but it has been the scene of much bloodshed during the island's struggle for freedom. It is said that no less than 8 battles have been fought on the hills in the rear, and one of the engagements ended most disastrously for the insurgents. During the 10 Years' War a party of patriots was surprised while crossing the valley by an overwhelming Spanish force. The former were carrying some wounded comrades towards a place of safety, and as they would not abandon their helpless friends, they failed to make good their retreat and were shot down to the last man by their merciless foes. A Cuban garden. This view is given to illustrate the better class of house and garden to be found in the suburbs of large Cuban cities. There is in the heavy masonry and the high iron fence a recognition of the national habit or custom of defense, and the statuary within is also characteristic. What will attract the reader most is the profusion of natural growth. The better class of gardens in and around the cities abound with vines of different kinds, the choicest varieties of convolvulus, laurels of great beauty, and climbing shrubs without number. Landscape gardening is not a fine art as in some parts of California and Florida, but the facilities for work of this kind are very numerous. The Infanta Isabel. The Spanish Navy is weak in battleships, but has a large number of swift cruisers and light craft better able to keep out of harm's way than to grapple with the heavier vessels of modern navies. The Infanta Isabel belongs to the 3D class of cruisers, upon which the Spanish government has placed great reliance. Some of its torpedo boats have great speed, some as much as 25 and 26 knots an hour. The Pelayo is the largest Spanish battleship, and the only one really in the same class as the better American vessels. The Vizcaya, which was inspected by thousands of people while at anchor off New York this spring, is an armed cruiser of the first class, with a speed of about 20 knots. Section of Havana Street. This view gives a good representation of a Havana street. The thoroughfares in the Cuban capital are very uniform in appearance, and they are narrow to an inconvenient extent. The sidewalks are barely wide enough for 2 people to pass, and the practice of building right up to the line makes the difficulty greater. Havana Cathedral. This is a side view of the front of the great cathedral. A better idea of the elevation and style can be obtained from the larger, full front view on another page. It will be noted that although the cathedral is in the very heart of the city, the sidewalks are as narrow and inconvenient as in the less important sections. The Yumare Valley. From San Severino Castle a glorious view can be obtained of the Yumare, or Gumuri, Valley. This beautiful valley has been likened to the Happy Valley immortalized in Ras Elis. It is surrounded by precipitous rocks, and in the early morning especially the scene is poetical in the extreme. It was here that one of the most brutal attacks were made on the natives of Cuba, in 1511, by the Spanish conquerors. No quarter was extended, and after thousands of unarmed natives had been massacred, those that survived hurled themselves in despair from the precipitous cliffs into the river below to escape what they realized would have been a worse fate. A narrow street. This view gives a section of one of the very narrow streets of Havana, so narrow that the light is always bad. The overhanging balconies approach each other so closely that conversation can be carried on between persons sitting in them without raising the voice. Below are the window openings with the constantly recurring iron bars. Students' Monument, Havana. This monument was erected to the memory of the 8 medical students who were shot on November 27, 1871, by the Havana volunteers under circumstances explained more fully on a preceding page. The boys were arrested with 35 others on the ridiculous charge of scratching the plate on a volunteer's vault. Entrance to Bellamar Caves, Matanzas. The Bellamar Caves at Matanzas have been described as second only in interest to the Mammoth Cave of Kentucky. They are very extensive and their exploration is a source of much interest to tourists. Cuban caves are numerous, but the location of most of them is known only to the so-called insurgents. The Bellamar Caves are larger and are much better known. The peculiarity of the roof of the entrance sheds will be noted, as well as the ubiquitous livery hack and the trees of different kinds, which grow without care of any description. The caves are visited by large social parties, and are a feature of the district. American steamer in Havana Harbor. This view was taken just prior to the departure of our artists and 2 newspaper friends from Havana. There were ships in the harbor waiting to sail, and their passage had been arranged for. The last day or 2 on shore drew out all the ingenuity of the unwelcome guests, who were in constant danger. In Ireland the pugilist is anxious to have someone tread on the tail of his coat, and in other countries various forms of insult are resorted to when a fight is desired. In Cuba it is usual to spit on the floor or ground in front of a man to express contempt, and this not very refined hint was used freely. That all finally got away unharmed is somewhat surprising. Matanzas Harbor. This harbor is located about 60 miles east of Havana. The bay differs from the majority on the Cuban coast in that it is widest at its mouth and narrows gradually. The town and harbor of Matanzas are at the extreme end, well protected from the ocean. The fortifications were never very formidable. They included San Severino Castle and another very old fort, both of which have received serious injury from American guns. The beauty of the bay has been commented on frequently, and the illustration shows how the trees and shrubs grow almost to the water's edge. The harbor itself will shelter almost any number of vessels. Cabanas Fortress. A party of Spanish officers on their way from Havana to Cabanas Fortress, the living tomb to which political prisoners and suspects are consigned. What tortures have been endured within its walls no mind can estimate, no pen depict. To a people who have lived in profound peace for more than 30 years the idea of incessant militarism, varied only by outbreaks of actual warfare, is not easily grasped. Such has, however, been the condition of Cuba for generations back, and this hated Bastille has been a continual reminder of the despotism of Spain. Many a patriot has died within it rather than betray his fellow rebels. Street scene, Havana. This scene is well selected, as it conveys a good idea of the mode of life in the city. The building in the foreground on the left is not a prison or even a school. It is simply a residence, built according to the prevalent custom right up to the edge of the sidewalk. The bars in front of the window are characteristic. Behind them the inmates can be seen at almost any time engaged in their household duties or killing time. During the evening the ladies frequently sit or stand behind the bars for hours at a time, smiling pleasantly to passers-by, and acknowledging with captivating bows the compliments freely paid them, even by utter strangers. Drawbridge Havana Fortifications. This picture gives an idea of the massiveness of the fortifications of Havana. The city was founded on its present site in 1519, but 10 years later it was destroyed by buccaneers. The location was so favorable for a fortified town that it was speedily reconstructed with the addition of the fortress of La Fuerza. About the middle of the 16th century it was again plundered by pirates, and this led to still more extensive work on the fortifications. The wall erected around the city has not been maintained, but relics of medieval style of drawbridges, fortresses, and heavy obstructions remain. The style of work is well shown above. Farm scene near Matanzas. This is a farm which has escaped attack from both the irregular Spanish forces and the insurgent Daesh, and as a result it shows more prosperity and animation than do those which have been attacked and at least partially laid waste. Expert agriculturalists agree that more can be realized from the soil in Cuba at less expense than in any other country, and the photograph above bears out the theory. The absence of wastelands and rocky creeks is a feature of Cuba, and the soil responds so promptly to the most primitive attempts at cultivation, that returns can be secured with gratifying certainty from the smallest expenditure of labor and capital. A wharf scene. Great enterprise has been displayed at times in Cuba in wharf building, and in nearly all the seaports admirable facilities for receiving and shipping freight can be found. In the rear of the picture the rigging of merchant vessels can be seen. To the left is the covered portion of the wharf, crowded as usual with stragglers in search of shade. In all semi-tropical countries idleness is a luxury highly appreciated, and no place appropriate for loafing is left long deserted. The Cuban wharf is also the scene of much genuine activity, the export business being very large, even when civil war hampers the output and causes a temporary suspension in several lines of manufacture and commerce. Havana Cathedral. This cathedral is of great historic interest. Within its massive walls is the tomb of Christopher Columbus, and here also the funeral services were held over the bodies of the gallant seamen who were blown up in the Maine. The artistic merit of this picture will commend itself at once to the students of architecture. The building was erected in 1724 and is a type of 18th century style, to which the people of Havana cling with strange pertinacity. Within the decorations are more elaborate, although far from uniform. The floor is of variegated marble and the frescoing on the walls is artistic. The altars are handsome and were erected at great expense. Entrance to San Lazaro Cemetery. The gateway and arch show the same heavy old-fashioned style of masonry so common in Cuba, while on right and left the rich foliage of the native trees is seen in pleasant relief. Interest in the cemetery centers in the fact that it forms the resting place of the remains of the main victims. Amid scenes of mingled sadness and indifference the bodies recovered were conveyed to the cemetery. Each was in a plain coffin which bore a silver cross and a card, on which was written the dead hero's name. There was a profusion of flowers and much genuine mourning on the part even of many who had resented the appearance of the vessel in the harbor. Whaler's Palace. This is the house in which Valenciano Whaler resided while engaged in the unrealized hope of subduing the Cubans. The Butcher, as this heartless tyrant is appropriately nicknamed, succeeded Martinez Campos, and with a great flourish of trumpets announced his intention of driving the insurgents into the sea. He constructed impassable trochas, through which the patriots passed and repassed at will. He took the field in person and fled back in haste to comparative safety in Havana. Then he commenced to wage war on women and children. His treatment of pacificos and non-combatants was indescribably brutal. Sugar plantation in Pina del Rio. This is another typical scene and a reminder of what Cuba might be today if fate had been kinder to it. Sugar has always been a staple product, and 40 years ago had assumed proportions of great magnitude. The plantations vary in size, some of them being very extensive as well as remarkably productive. The canes grow into a network of forest and undergrowth, sufficiently dense to afford concealment for an army of average size. When outnumbered the insurgents have again and again sought refuge among the canes, whence they have fired volley after volley into the ranks of Spanish soldiers, who could only shoot back at random. A villa in Matanzas. This is a comparatively new structure in admirable order, without the symptoms of decay and old age which are to be found in and around almost every building. It is a strictly fashionable residence of one story with overhanging porch and massive pillars. The window openings are as large as the doors, and much more numerous. During the daytime they admit an abundance of light and air, but at night the absence of glass makes it necessary to keep the shutters closed, and the ventilation is much impaired. Our artists were invited into the interior of this ideal little home and were well entertained, although their limited knowledge of Spanish interfered sadly with their enjoyment of the episode. Reconcentrado hut at Santa Clara. This picture represents in more ways than one the fertility of Cuban soil and the immense variety of the native product. A cheaper home could scarcely be devised. Such were hurriedly constructed by the peaceful tillers of Cuban soil, who were driven into the cities by Weyler's manifesto, to disobey which was to die at the hands of Spanish guerrillas. The poor people who could scarcely subsist at home were huddled together around the different cities, where thousands starved to death. The United States government, after Weyler's recall, secured permission to send food to the sufferers, but the relief was necessarily slight, and ceased entirely when war was declared. A villa in ruins. This is the picture of a ruined home in Victoria de las Tunas. Once a well-appointed house, it has fallen a victim to the ravages of war, and its walls have been used as protection while shooting and fighting has been rampant. More than once opposing forces have fought each other from within and without, and the original occupants have long disappeared from view entirely. Like other houses in the outlying districts of cities, it has been in constant danger of raids, and the stronger the general construction, the greater this danger has appeared to be. No one can estimate the number of houses which have been devastated in this way, or how long and costly will be the process of restoration. Leprosy Hospital near Matanzas. This is an admirable picture of the lepers' hospital. From time immemorial, leprosy has been regarded as one of the most loathsome diseases to which mankind is subject, and the leper is almost invariably condemned to absolute isolation. The hospital here illustrated is as far removed from the outside world as though it were situated on a barren rock in mid-ocean. In the calm of the semi-tropical night, the building seems to be guarded by an almost supernatural solitude, and the superstitions which are explained to the visitor are easily accounted for. All hope abandon ye who enters here, is a legend which recurs to the mind as the most natural corollary on the place and its surroundings. Cactus by the roadside. The soil of Cuba is well adapted for the growth of the cactus, which thrives well in the island's latitude. It grows rapidly, sometimes assuming a great height, but in a majority of instances clustering, as in the illustration. It is needless to say that a cactus hedge is almost impassable, and that, beautiful as it looks, it can successfully compete with barbed wire, if not as a clothes destroyer, at least as a skin irritant. The picture shows a stretch of good road, with some lofty palms in the background, and with a load of farm produce being hauled to market in a characteristic vehicle. San Juan River. This is a view of the San Juan River near its mouth. The country in the foreground is of interest, as it is said to be the actual birthplace of Cuban freedom, and the site of the first gathering of the insurgents at the commencement of the last insurrection. Hurried councils were held and a plan of campaign mapped out. The patriots have passed over the ground several times when raiding the outskirts of the adjoining city, and many deeds of daring are recounted in connection with it. The scene in the background is suggestive, full of animation and a faithful representation of the general outline of the country. A Cuban wagon. This is an old-time Cuban wagon or cart, of a type little used in the cities, but still common in the poorer inland districts. It has some points of resemblance to the ancient cart sometimes seen in New Mexico and Arizona, and seems to give general defiance to modern advance and civilization. The massive wheels, the cumbersome brake shoe and the general lack of symmetry combine to make the old Cuban cart compare most unfavorably, even with the much criticized prairie schooner of the western states. For hauling light produce over hilly roads, the vehicle answers its purpose, and hence its survival. Harbor at Santiago de Cuba, from the city. This is a splendid view of the inner harbor at Santiago de Cuba, with the mountains in the rear. The Spanish fleet under Cervera ran into the harbor during the month of May 1898, and anchored in the portion of the harbor so accurately portrayed above. The heroic act of Lieutenant Hobson in sinking the Merrimac at the entrance to the bay and thus effectually bottling up Cervera will give to Santiago de Cuba a historic interest second to no city in the Antilles, and this view imparts much valuable information as to the harbor and its surroundings. A Matanzas home. The cheerless walls shown above enclose a really comfortable home, in some respects quite luxurious. The house is occupied by a Cuban merchant of considerable means. The floors are carpetless, as is the general custom, but the general furnishing are luxurious. The bedsteads are of brass with heavy canopies, and some of the chairs are stately in appearance. The house is an unpretentious one, far beneath the financial possibilities of the occupant, who, like many other Cuban merchants who have escaped actual trouble, has found it desirable to live very quietly during the true blues times of recent date.